Imagine finding a dusty, ancient manuscript that perfectly explains the intricate core of early Christian theology.
Right.
Like it talks about the unity of the Godhead, the concept of the Word, and, a holy Trinity.
Yeah, the absolute bedrock of it.
Exactly. It reads like the foundational text of the early church. But now, imagine discovering that this exact same text was supposedly written by a 300-year-old Egyptian god.
Right, with the head of a wading bird.
Yeah, a waiting bird who supposedly taught magic to Abraham, like long before Moses even existed.
It sounds like, I don't know, the plot of a surreal historical thriller, or maybe the world's most complicated ancient conspiracy theory.
It really does.
But it's actually one of the most fascinating documented realities of classical history.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are wading right into a historical paradox that honestly completely upends how we think about ancient wisdom and, the transmission of knowledge.
Oh, absolutely.
We are tracking the impossible evolution of Hermes Trismegistus. How exactly did an Egyptian deity of the moon and measurement transform into a philosophical contemporary of the biblical patriarchs?
And then ultimately become a beloved, revered intellectual mascot for early Christian theologians.
Right. The sheer mileage that this single identity gets across millennia is staggering.
It really forces us to reconsider how history is actually written. And, more importantly, how it gets rewritten by people with very specific agendas.
So our mission today is to trace that evolution step by meticulous step.
Yeah.
And to do this, we're pulling from a massive, really eclectic stack of sources.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover.
We do. We have ancient Hermetic texts, specifically the famous Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablets.
Right.
We're also looking at deeply researched mythological studies on the Egyptian god Thoth.
Which are incredible on their own.
Totally. And then, to tie it all together, we are diving into some rigorous 19th century theological analyses by Victorian scholars, particularly the work of John David Chambers.
Because to truly make sense of this, we can't just look at the texts in a vacuum.
No, definitely not.
We have to understand the specific cultures that produced them, the people who translated them, and the later generations who sometimes completely accidentally misinterpreted them.
Exactly. So if you're listening to this right now, whether you're a seasoned history buff, someone interested in philosophy, or just, trying to survive your commute, understanding Hermes Trismegistus is the ultimate masterclass in how human beings synthesize, recycle, and elevate information.
It really is. It's a story about branding, survival, and just the human search for universal truth.
So let's wind the clock all the way back to the literal mythological roots of this figure. We have three distinct eras to cover today: the era of legend, the era of theology, and the era of reception.
Right, the three big phases.
So long before the philosophy, long before the Christian era, we have to start in the sands of ancient Egypt with the god Thoth.
Yeah, and to understand Thoth, you really have to understand a civilization that worshipped him for, like, at least 3,000 years before a single Christian text was ever written.
Which is an unfathomable amount of time.
It is. Thoth was a foundational pillar of the Egyptian pantheon, and he was primarily recognized by a very specific, unmistakable symbol, the ibis bird.
Right.
In ancient Egyptian, the word for the ibis was thun.
And it's such a specific animal to elevate to godhood. The ibis is a wading bird.
Yeah, poking around in the mud.
Exactly. If you've ever seen one, it has this very distinct, long, downward curving beak. It spends its time in the mud of the Nile. Why look at a marsh bird and decide, yep, that is the architect of the universe?
It's a great question. It really comes down to how the ancient Egyptians interpreted the visual world around them.
Okay, how so?
Well, they were keen observers of nature, and they projected those observations onto the cosmos. So popular Egyptian fancy likened that specific downward curving beak of the ibis to the sickle crescent of the moon. Oh, wow. So they literally saw the shape of the moon walking around in the reeds.
Exactly. And this visual connection wasn't just like a casual resemblance.
Yeah.
It completely solidified his role as a moon god.
That's fascinating.
Our sources point out that later Hellenistic texts even tried to deepen this biological justification.
Really? How?
They claim that the mixture of black and white in the ibis's plumage perfectly resembled the phases of the waning moon, the interplay of light and shadow in the night sky.
That is brilliant. They are looking at biology and reverse engineering a theology from it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
But the ibis wasn't his only symbol, which is where things get even more complex.
Right, the baboon.
Yes. Thoth is also heavily associated with the baboon, or the dog-headed ape, the cynocephalus.
And while the ibis might have been the older symbol tied deeply to ancient pyramid rituals where the ibis god is depicted carrying the soul of the pharaoh, the ape symbol introduces a totally different philosophical dimension.
It really does. When you see the ape in Egyptian art, it is almost always sitting on the balance, the great scales of judgment, the weighing of the heart in the underworld.
Precisely. Thoth, in this ape form, is intimately connected with the concept of the heart and the mind. He even bears the formal title, the Heart of Re.
Re being the sun god.
Right.
So he's the intelligence behind the entire operation. Our sources highlight that Thoth held these incredibly foundational structural roles in Egyptian mythology.
He really did.
He is the inventor of script. He's the lord of ritual. He is the ultimate author of sacred knowledge. I mean, the ancient texts literally refer to him as the one who gave words and script.
Yeah, the literal inventor of writing.
Furthermore, he's the psychopomp,
Right.
the divine guide of the dead who navigates souls through the treacherous paths of the afterlife.
And you have to look at the mechanics of why those roles intersect. I mean, why does a moon god invent writing?
Yeah, it doesn't seem obvious at first.
Because the moon is how you measure time. It's the original calendar. If you measure time, you can record time. If you record time, you become the scribe. And if you are the scribe of the universe, you are the one who records the divine laws.
It's a perfect logical cascade of divine responsibilities.
It really is.
I love how mechanical that is. It actually makes me think of an analogy. As I was reading through the source stack about Thoth's responsibilities, I realized he operates exactly like an ancient IT administrator for the cosmos.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this, but flesh that out.
Yeah.
How is a bird god an IT guy?
Okay, think about the mechanics you just described. He's the guy who literally wrote the operating system of the universe.
Okay, I'm with you.
The ritual of the dead, that massive collection of spells and passwords needed to navigate the afterlife. That is the source code.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Thoth is the one managing the divine network, making sure that cosmic order, what the Egyptians called Ma'at, keeps running smoothly without crashing.
He fixes the bugs in the timeline.
Exactly. He fixes the bugs, he balances the servers on those scales of justice. And when a soul needs to transition from the mortal server to the eternal one, he acts as the psychopomp, guiding them through the firewall so they don't get corrupted.
That is a surprisingly robust metaphor. And just like an IT administrator, he is entirely indispensable to the higher-ups.
Totally.
In the legends, he's the chief minister to the ruler of the universe. The supreme gods might issue the commands, but Thoth is the one who uses his words, the code, to actually establish the world.
So without him, the divine decrees are just ideas.
Right. With him, they become reality.
Okay, so we have this incredibly powerful, foundational Egyptian deity. He measures the stars, he writes the laws, he guides the souls. But Egypt doesn't exist in a vacuum.
No, it doesn't.
Fast forward a couple of millennia, and we get a massive cultural collision. The Greeks arrive.
Right. And this brings us to the Ptolemaic period. After Alexander the Great conquers Egypt in 332 BC, his general, Ptolemy, establishes a Greek dynasty there.
And suddenly you have this intense, unprecedented blending of cultures.
Exactly. In Hellenic Egypt, particularly in a city like Alexandria, which becomes the intellectual capital of the ancient world, you have Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, all rubbing shoulders.
And when cultures collide like that, their gods collide too. The Greeks arrive in Egypt, they look at Thoth, and they say, hang on a second, we know this guy.
Yeah, because the Greeks had their own deity Hermes.
Right, and let's look at the functional overlap. What was the Greek Hermes? He was the messenger of the gods, a deity of communication, language, and travel.
And critically, he was also a psychopomp.
Right.
He was the one who guided Greek souls down to Hades.
So the parallels are just screaming at them.
They were way too strong to ignore. The process is called syncretism, the merging of different beliefs and deities. The Greeks and Egyptians essentially folded them into a single syncretic figure, Hermes Thoth.
It's like a theological merger.
Yeah, exactly. He retains the ancient mystical prestige of the Egyptian Thoth, but adopts the more philosophical, conversational accessibility of the Greek Hermes.
Which brings us to the name that defines our entire deep dive. We know Hermes, we know Thoth. But when we talk about this specific historical figure, we call him Hermes Trismegistus.
Right.
What does Trismegistus actually mean, functionally?
Linguistically, it translates directly to thrice great, or great, 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 or sometimes the greatest great.
Where does a title like that even originate? I mean, did some Alexandrian hype man just decide Hermes the Great wasn't punchy enough for a new manuscript?
It's actually a fascinating linguistic evolution rooted in real archaeological artifacts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, long before the term Trismegistus was formally used in the 2nd century of the Christian era, we find evidence of its origins on things like the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Yeah. The stone features the repetition of the Greek words megas, 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 great, great, great to describe the god.
Oh, I see.
In ancient Egyptian grammar, repeating an adjective was a way of expressing the superlative. Over time, that clunky repetition just condensed into the single powerful title, Trismegistus.
That makes perfect sense linguistically. But there has to be a philosophical layer to it, right? Because in ancient traditions, a name is never just a name. The number 3 is always loaded with meaning.
Oh, absolutely. Theologically and philosophically, the thrice great title takes on a life of its own. It comes to represent his absolute mastery over the 3 parts of the wisdom of the whole universe.
According to the Hermetic sources, these are the spiritual, psychic, and corporeal realms, right?
Right. Often symbolized in antiquity as heaven, air, and earth.
The entirety of existence.
Exactly. It also refers to his legendary triple role in human society.
Okay, what were those roles?
As this figure evolved from a pure god into a legendary historical man, the esoteric tradition considered him the ultimate polymath. He was the greatest priest, the greatest philosopher, and the greatest king.
The ultimate triple threat. Priest, philosopher, and king. That really marks the shift, doesn't it?
It really does.
We move away from the ibis poking in the mud. We move away from a literal god of the pantheon. Suddenly, this syncretic culture is talking about Hermes Trismegistus as a legendary flesh-and-blood historical man.
And this is where the mythological timeline gets incredibly audacious.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at traditions encapsulated in later summaries like the Kabbalion, they claim Hermes wasn't just a myth. They say he lived in the flesh.
And not just a normal human lifespan.
No, they claim he lived in Egypt for 300 years.
3 centuries. The text literally calls him the master of masters. It claims he was the father of occult wisdom, the founder of astrology, the discoverer of alchemy.
It's quite the resume.
It is. But here is the part that I found most staggering in our sources. They didn't just place him in history, they placed him deep in history. They claimed his life occurred long before the days of Moses.
Right.
Some traditions went so far as to assert he was a contemporary of Abraham, and that Abraham actually traveled to Egypt and learned mystic knowledge directly from him.
Think about the sheer authority that grants him. In the ancient world, antiquity is synonymous with legitimacy.
That makes sense.
If you can convince people that your foundational thinker literally taught the patriarch of the Abrahamic faiths, his authority becomes absolute. You cannot argue with the guy who taught Abraham.
And because his teachings were so profoundly revered, because they held the so-called operating system of the universe, they were heavily guarded. The followers of Hermes believed in an incredibly strict code of secrecy.
Which is precisely where we get the modern word hermetic.
Right.
When we say something has a hermetic seal, meaning it's airtight and nothing can escape, we are directly referencing the sealing of these ancient mysteries.
That is so cool to think about.
The tradition operated on a very strict pedagogical principle: milk for babes, meat for strong men.
Meaning you don't drop advanced cosmic truths on someone who hasn't done the foundational work. You keep the deepest truths sealed away for the initiated.
You don't cast pearls before swine. It was a fiercely safeguarded intellectual tradition.
So if we have this incredibly secretive tradition, locked behind a hermetic seal, guarded by initiates who believe it dates back to the time of Abraham, well, the obvious question is, how did the text actually get out?
Yeah.
What did it actually say? Because a legendary figure living for 300 years, keeping cosmic secrets, that figure needs a legendary text.
Absolutely.
So let's move into our second era, the era of theology. Let's crack the seal and look at the actual writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus.
The core documents of this philosophical tradition are known collectively as the Corpus Hermeticum, alongside famous independent fragments like the Emerald Tablets.
And I have to say, evaluating the philosophy contained within them is breathtaking. It is incredibly rich and layered.
It really is.
I want to read what is probably the most famous maxim from the entire Hermetic tradition. It's from the Emerald Tablets, and it goes like this. That which is below is like that which is on high, and that which is on high is like that which is below. By these things are made the miracles of one thing.
It's pure poetry.
It is.
And what's vital to grasp here is how that single, elegant sentence encapsulates the entire engine of the Hermetic worldview. It is the absolute distillation of the concept of the macrocosm and the microcosm.
I want to really take our time and unpack this because it's the bedrock of so much Western esoteric thought.
Okay, let's do it.
When they say on high and below, we're talking about the macrocosm, meaning the universe, the grand scale of existence.
Yes. The entire universe, the cosmos, the divine sphere that is the macrocosm. And the individual human being is the microcosm, the little universe.
Okay.
Hermetic philosophy teaches that there is an underlying, unbreakable unity beneath all the duality we experience in life.
So everything is connected.
Deeply. The universe above what philosophers call the intelligible sphere, the realm of pure thought and divine order, is perfectly mirrored in the sensible universe below, the physical world we touch and feel.
So if I'm understanding this mechanism correctly, they are saying that the divine architecture of the stars, the planets, the literal mind of God is reflected perfectly in the architecture of the human soul.
That is exactly it.
It's almost like a holographic universe theory. If you cut a piece of a hologram, the tiny piece still contains the entire image of the whole.
That is a phenomenal modern analogy for it, yes. Every human being is a fractal of the divine cosmos.
Wow.
Which means, practically speaking, the path to understanding the universe isn't necessarily building a better telescope.
It's looking inward.
Right. If you truly understand the depths of yourself, you understand the mechanics of the universe.
Which leads to the ultimate goal of the Hermetic practitioner. It isn't just about knowing trivia, it's an active process. Our sources call this ultimate realization the Hermetic marriage.
Correct. And we have to be clear, this is not a literal wedding between two people.
Right, no caterers involved.
No caters. It is a process of internal alchemy.
Explain that mechanism. How does internal alchemy work?
In Hermeticism, the human soul is often fractured by the great opposites of existence. Spirit and matter, light and dark, male and female, intellect and emotion.
We're constantly pulled in different directions.
Exactly. The Hermetic marriage is the reunion of these divided aspects within oneself, often allegorically referred to as the king and the queen.
Okay, I've heard that imagery before.
It is the painstaking process of balancing the eternal spirit with the heavy physical reality of matter. When a practitioner achieves this perfect internal equilibrium, they essentially restore the holy empire within themselves.
They cease to be a fractured human.
Right, they become the adept, the philosopher king.
They achieve a state of pure divine consciousness. And our sources mention this adept is often symbolized by a very specific icon, the two-headed eagle.
Yes, an icon that has survived in various esoteric and Masonic traditions to this very day.
I've definitely seen that symbol.
And historically, that eagle is actually a gradual derivation from the original Egyptian phoenix, the Bennu bird.
Oh, that's a cool connection.
The two heads of the eagle look in completely opposite directions, representing that ultimate mastery and suspension of the great opposites. Spirit and matter, past and future, above and below, perfectly united and governed by one single central body.
It is stunning, evocative imagery. But as I was reading through the source stacks, studying this macrocosm and microcosm philosophy, I hit a massive thematic wall. Something didn't add up at all.
Oh, what stood out to you?
The theology. We started this deep dive with Thoth, the ibis, the baboon, the Egyptian pantheon, a deeply polytheistic world with hundreds of gods managing different rivers and stars.
Right.
But when you actually read the translated texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, they don't read like ancient Egyptian polytheism. They don't read like spells to appease a river god.
No, they don't.
They read remarkably like early Christianity.
The shift is definitely jarring if you're expecting Egyptian myth. The philosophical framework of the Corpus Hermeticum is deeply Neoplatonic, and the theology itself is startlingly monotheistic.
Let's define Neoplatonic for the listener, because that's a term historians throw around a lot. We're talking about a philosophical system that grew out of Plato's ideas, right?
Exactly. Neoplatonism really takes shape in the 3rd century AD, spearheaded by thinkers like Plotinus. It posits that everything in the universe emanates from a single, ineffable, supreme source called the One. It's not a pantheon of squabbling gods. It's one pure source of goodness and intellect, and the physical world is just a series of descending emanations from that one.
Like light radiating from a bulb, getting dimmer the further out it goes.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. The Hermetic texts align perfectly with this. They speak constantly of the one mind, which they declare is more divine and operative than anything else in existence.
The sources also point out they describe something called the bonus genius.
The good mind, or the good demon, which they say fills the blessed soul and guides it toward the light.
And this is where my historian alarm bells started ringing wildly. The sources show that these Hermetic texts explicitly teach the unity of the Godhead. They even describe a Holy Trinity, God the Father, the Word or Son, and the Holy Spirit.
It's all there in the text.
So I have to ask the obvious question. If this text was supposedly written by an ancient Egyptian contemporary of Abraham, how does it perfectly mirror Christian theology that wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years?
It's the million-dollar question.
Are we looking at a giant historical scam? Is the Corpus Hermeticum a forgery?
This is the crux of the entire mystery, and it requires us to put on our most rigorous historical detective hats. To answer that, scholars, particularly in the 19th century, realized they had to separate the texts.
Okay, separate them how?
They had to distinguish between what they called the genuine Hermetic works and the later false works that were cynically attributed to Hermes.
But wait, hang on. How are we defining genuine here? Because if the whole thing is supposedly from a 300-year-old bird god, isn't it all technically false?
That is an excellent point. Genuine in this scholarly context does not mean written by a magical pre-Mosaic demigod.
Right.
It means texts that authentically belong to the original core burst of Alexandrian philosophical writings from the early Christian era, roughly the 1st to 3rd centuries AD. Texts like the Pomandres, which is often called the first book of Hermes. These core texts are the ones that align tightly with this monotheistic Neoplatonic view.
Okay, so the genuine texts are the ones actually from that era of early Christianity.
Yes. They emphasize God as the unconditioned, self-existent maker and creator. They are authentic products of a very specific historical, spiritual awakening in Alexandria.
Okay, so if the Pomandres is genuine to that era, what makes a text false?
The false ones are later additions written centuries after that core movement, often to push a very specific regressive agenda. But the authors slapped the famous Hermes brand on the manuscript to give their new political or religious agenda ancient authority.
Sneaky.
Very. A primary example identified in our sources is a text called the Asclepius, or the Sacred Book.
Let's treat this like a true crime investigation. How do we know, for an absolute fact, that the Asclepius is a later forgery and not part of the original core text?
We have two smoking guns. The first is a massive contradiction in internal doctrine. As we established, the genuine core texts emphasize a supreme, unnamed, single God. It's an elevated, almost abstract monotheism. But the Asclepius text suddenly pivots and actively defends idol worship.
Wait, really?
Yes, it fiercely protects the localized polytheistic practices of the dying Egyptian religion, which was under threat at the time.
That is a huge red flag. You don't spend chapters establishing the ineffable one mind and then suddenly demand people sacrifice a goat to a statue.
Right, the theological whiplash is obvious, but the second smoking gun is entirely chronological, and it is impossible to refute.
Give it to me.
The Asclepius text contains repeated, explicit references to a man named Ammonius Saccas.
Wait, Ammonius Saccas. I know that name from classical philosophy. He's the guy who taught Plotinus, right?
Yeah.
He is widely considered the actual founder of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria.
Precisely, and Ammonius Saccas died around 8241.
Oh, wow. So the timeline completely collapses.
It crumbles instantly.
You have a text claiming to be ancient, claiming to possess the primeval wisdom of the Egyptian gods. And it is casually referencing a local college professor who died in the middle of the 3rd century AD.
It is the ultimate historical tell. It definitively proves that these specific texts were written centuries later. The practice is called pseudepigrapha, which literally means false superscription.
False superscription.
Right. It's the ancient practice of writing a new text under a false, famous ancient name to instantly gain legitimacy and a built-in audience.
So Hermes Trismegistus basically became an open source pen name.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. He was an intellectual franchise.
It makes so much sense when you think about human nature. If you were a Hellenic writer in Alexandria and you had a brand new philosophical movement you desperately wanted to promote, you didn't publish it under your own name.
No, of course not.
Because no one cares what Demetrius from the library thinks.
Right.
But if you slap by Hermes Trismegistus, Master of Masters, on the scroll, it instantly has ancient gravitas. People will read it. It's like writing a modern self-help book, but instead of putting your name on it, you claim it was dictated by the ghost of Socrates.
And the most incredible part of this historical phenomenon, it worked.
Did it really?
It worked unbelievably well. People bought it completely. Which brings us to the reception of these texts, and one of the greatest historical ironies of all time.
Let's dive into that reception. That's our third era. Because if we, sitting here with our modern historical tools, know that these texts were actually early Christian-era writings wrapped in an ancient Egyptian aesthetic, we have to ask, did the people back then know that?
They absolutely did not. And the reaction of the early Christian church fathers to these texts is the most surprising counterintuitive twist in this entire narrative.
Right, we need to talk about the ante-Nicene Fathers. For the listener, these are the foundational Christian theologians who lived and wrote before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
The heavyweights of the early church.
Exactly. We are talking about figures like Justin Martyr, Cyprian, Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, and Cyril of Alexandria. Now, logic dictates that if these devout Christian leaders look at a text attributed to an Egyptian god of magic, a guy with the head of an ibis, they are going to condemn him.
You'd think so.
They are going to label him a pagan idolater, burn the scrolls, and move on. But they didn't. They love him.
They didn't just love him, they weaponized him. They used Hermes Trismegistus right alongside Plato as their primary intellectual tools to validate Christianity to the sophisticated pagan world.
I want to read some specific quotes from our sources because I want to make sure we represent the theological views of these church fathers exactly as they were presented historically as objective facts.
Oh, sure.
Our source material highlights Cyril of Alexandria. Cyril actually notes that Hermes, despite being a priest of idols in the minds of the people,
Yeah.
is always found mindful of the things of Moses.
Yes. Cyril is looking at the text and saying, look at the parallels. He knows the truth. And Cyprian, another major figure, wrote enthusiastically that Hermes speaks of one God and confesses him to be incomprehensible and inestimable.
Lactantius goes even further than that. He essentially treats Hermes as an uncanonized prophet.
He really does.
He praises Hermes for asserting the majesty of the supreme and only God, and he points out a linguistic match. Lactantius says, look, Hermes calls God by the exact same names we Christians use, God and Father. He even quotes a Hermetic text where Hermes calls the divine word the second God and his own son.
To understand why they embraced this so fervently, you have to look at the intellectual climate of the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Okay, set the scene for us.
You have these early church fathers trying to convert an incredibly intelligent, philosophically trained Hellenistic world. They are debating Greeks and Romans who are steeped in Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism.
The tough crowd.
Very tough. So when these fathers saw the Hermetic texts, which, let's remember the irony, were actually written during their own era, birthed out of the exact same turbulent religious seas of Hellenic Egypt, they didn't realize they were reading their contemporaries.
Oh, man.
They thought they were reading the ancient prophecies of a man who lived before Moses.
That is the great chronological blunder. It is a massive, continent-spanning historical irony.
It's incredible.
The church fathers thought, look, we don't even have to convince you pagans with our books. Look at your own books.
Yeah.
Even your most ancient, revered Egyptian sage, the guy who invented writing, predicted the exact theology of Christianity. Checkmate.
Exactly. It was the ultimate apologetic tool, but it was entirely based on a timeline error. They failed to distinguish the genuine early century Alexandrian works from the actual ancient Egyptian myths.
Right.
And they were completely tricked by the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic aesthetic that the Hellenistic writers deliberately wrapped the philosophy in.
But wait, how does an entire generation of brilliant theologians get catfished by an aesthetic? I mean, why didn't they realize the timeline was completely off? Didn't anyone notice that no one was speaking ancient Egyptian anymore?
That's where we have to give them some grace. The historical and linguistic tools we have today simply didn't exist for them.
That's fair.
Furthermore, the use of Egyptian hieroglyphics actually lasted much longer than modern people used to think. It survived well into the Roman period, down to the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, who died in 313 AD.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the visual aesthetic of ancient Egypt was still actively present around them. The early fathers, and astonishingly, even the later Renaissance editors up until the 15th century, believed Hermes was a literal ancient man.
So for over 1,000 years, the greatest minds in Europe and the Mediterranean read these texts as ancient prophecy, completely blind to the fact that it was retroactive synthesis.
Precisely. They recognized a profound, resonant philosophical truth in the texts that aligned with their own beliefs. And because it resonated so deeply, they assumed its origin must be incredibly ancient and divine.
It's a very human bias, isn't it?
Yeah.
If something feels profoundly true to me, it must be universally, anciently true.
Exactly.
So if the illusion holds for over a millennium, how does the bubble finally burst? How was the chronological blunder eventually uncovered and corrected?
Well, this brings us to the 19th
The
century.
Victorian reception.
Yes, the 19th century is when textual criticism really matures as a science. Scholars start analyzing linguistic drift, vocabulary, and historical references with a new level of rigor.
Right.
And in the context of Hermes, a Victorian scholar named John David Chambers becomes a pivotal figure.
Our sources focus heavily on Chambers. He translates these theological works for a Victorian audience, but he makes a very deliberate, almost aggressive framing choice right out of the gate.
He really sets the record straight.
He does. He explicitly titles his translation, The Theological and Philosophical Works of Hermes Trismegistus, Christian Neoplatonist.
He just puts the answer right there on the cover. He completely strips away the contemporary of Abraham myth. He bypasses the Egyptian bird god aesthetic, and he slaps the historically rigorously accurate label on the text.
He calls it exactly what it is, a Christian Neoplatonist text. But he didn't just change the title. The sources note that Chambers did something incredibly meticulous to prove his point.
Yeah, he did the heavy lifting.
He included highly specific, exhaustive notes and extensive indices in his translation.
And we have to ask why a scholar goes through the grueling trouble of indexing every single philosophical term across hundreds of pages.
Right.
Chambers did it because he wanted to definitively, mathematically correct the messy chronological and theological debates of the past centuries.
He wanted to show the receipts.
Exactly. By meticulously tracing the exact textual parallels, the shared vocabulary, the specific phrasing between the words of Hermes and the writings of the early church fathers and Neoplatonists, Chambers was building an airtight case.
Wow.
He was proving that these texts were undeniably the product of an Alexandrian religious synthesis in the early centuries AD.
He's saying to the reader, look at the Greek vocabulary being used. Look at the specific structure of the philosophy. An ancient Egyptian from 2000 BC does not write like this.
Right.
This is a Greek-speaking, Egyptian-influenced intellectual living in the Roman Empire.
But what is crucial about Chambers' work is that he isn't doing this to destroy the text. He isn't dismissing it as a worthless forgery.
That's an important distinction.
It is. He wanted to preserve the profound philosophical value of the Corpus Hermeticum, the beauty of the macrocosm, the inner alchemy, while finally grounding it in its true historical reality. It has value because of its ideas, not because of a fake pedigree.
So as we step back and look at this entire historical landscape, the sheer morphing of this identity is dizzying. Over 3,000 years, diverse scholars and civilizations shifted their interpretation of this figure radically.
It's hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
Let's recap this impossible journey. First, he is Thoth, the ancient magical god, the ibis in the reeds managing the scales of justice.
Right.
Then, he is Trismegistus, the prophetic 300-year-old contemporary of Moses teaching the patriarchs. Then, he is a weaponized apologetic tool for early Christianity. And finally, he is recognized as a Hellenistic philosophical pseudonym, the ultimate open-source pen name for Alexandrian thinkers.
It is a breathtaking survival story. Hermes Trismegistus is the ultimate historical chameleon. But the reason he survived isn't just because the branding was clever. It's a testament to the power of the ideas themselves.
That's the real takeaway here. Regardless of who actually held the pen, whether it was a priest of Ammon or a Greek philosopher named Demetrius, the core concept survived.
Yeah.
The idea of the one mind, the interconnectedness of as above, so below, the deeply human pursuit of inner equilibrium, and the Hermetic marriage. Those ideas survived because they resonated across entirely different civilizations, empires, and religions.
The truth is, knowledge is most valuable when it is understood and applied by the individual, regardless of the mythical brand name attached to it. The early Christians found value in it, the Neoplatonists found value in it, and modern esoteric traditions still find value in it today.
Which brings this entirely abstract history right back down to you, the listener. We live in a modern age of relentless information overload. We are constantly bombarded with gurus, podcasts, articles, and thought leaders telling us they have the ultimate framework for reality.
It's overwhelming.
It is. And the story of Hermes represents a deeply ingrained human desire. We are all desperately trying to find a single unifying source of wisdom that makes the universe make sense.
We want the operating system. We want the code.
Exactly. But this deep dive is also a brilliant, flashing warning sign. It reminds us to always question the timeline, the origins, and the authorship of the authorities we trust.
Critical thinking has to be the filter. We have to look past the packaging, past the ancient aesthetic or the modern marketing, and evaluate the ideas themselves.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this journey, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over today. We have just explored how an entire millennium of brilliant, highly educated scholars, the greatest minds of their generations, were completely convinced that an early Christian-era philosophical text was actually written by a magical pre-Moses Egyptian demigod. They
Yeah.
believed it with all their hearts because the packaging was so convincing and the ideas felt so right.
Hmm.
So look around at the world today. Look at the frameworks you use.
Right.
What universally accepted historical truths, what ancient wisdoms, or even what modern scientific narratives that we're currently taking for granted that might just be the result of incredibly good centuries-old branding.
It definitely makes you wonder how many of our modern foundations are built on open source pen names.
It really does.
Yeah.
The historical muddy waters are everywhere if you know where to look. Thank you for joining us on this massive journey from the banks of the ancient Nile, through the libraries of Alexandria, all the way to the Victorian studies. Keep questioning the timeline, keep seeking out the true origins of the knowledge in your own world, and we will see you on the next deep dive.